everyone. Welcome to Tuesday's extra regular meeting. And today we're focused, it's a work session, we're focused on clear and objective update. We are going to add item agenda D, items for commission and staff. And because we have someone from the public tonight, I'd like to have a public comment period. So we have 10 minutes at the beginning of planning commission meetings, as you know, that we can hear from the public. Would you like to speak since you've got the time and we're all ears?
Todd Boyle, not to tie up any of your time, but
Can you
yesterday,
just, your name and.
Todd Boyle out there in Alan Zelenka's ward.
Great.
The Housing Tools and Strategies report yesterday reported that there are 36,000 Eugenians living on incomes of $1,000 a month or less. And so the approximate amount of rent that they can afford is like $300 a month. The richest can afford $300 a month, and all the rest of them less. And so what this means is they're all basically not able to pay market rents, and that's 20% of the city. And so it seems to me that the gap between what they can pay, or the capital equivalent is a $50,000 purchase of a house, because the mortgage on a $50,000 house is $350 a month. I mean, so what I'm asking the planning commission is, how about letting us divide up the land into pieces of land that are small enough so that people can build tiny houses and cheap structures on them and get that price down around $50,000. And so that'd be like about 1,000 square feet. The people in the tiny house meetings just swoon over the incredibly great that would be to own their own property, 1,000 square feet. That's 30 by 35 feet, and put their tiny house on there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come here on this rainy night. And happy holidays to you. Okay, so we'll move to work session, clear and objective update. Janessa, do you want to start, or should we just do you want to say something before we kind of continue with our discussion from yesterday? As a reminder, or add additional information?
I do have a little bit of additional, it's not necessarily information, but Commissioner Fragola, you had mentioned maybe like a kind of example regarding the tree preservation standards and changing the criterion that now only requires consideration. And so I did bring, this is not, not something to get attached to any numbers that are up there, but this is just an example of one jurisdictions. I believe this one was in like Florida, but this is an example of where this jurisdiction addresses it where based on the residential lot size, you have a minimum number of required trees. And then their method of dealing with that is that you either preserve that minimum number of trees or replant them. And then you can have exemptions as far as like, for instance, in our area, we have some lots that, are very small. Maybe we wouldn't want them to apply to small lots, or there would be some things that we could dial in when we were drafting code. But this is just an example of a way that you could get it at a preservation standard that could be very clear and objective.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a nice example. So I thought maybe I would start, since I was the one that actually communicated kind of a larger concern. So one of the ideas that I had as I was thinking about it, realizing that my example is actually fairly, there's some nuances with the example. So one of the challenges that I have with the recommendation is that there are variation in terms of site and type of zoning. So I'm wondering if we want to, I would feel more comfortable if we looked at single family is very different than multifamily in terms of what's required for development. So in terms of what owners are balancing in terms of required open space, parking, landscaping and parking, the various multifamily standards. So they're balancing a whole bunch of demands, stormwater, on-site stormwater facilities. takes up quite a lot of space. You can't put certain trees in these stormwater facilities depending on how you design them. For instance, they could be a grassy swale. Even in a vegetated swale, there's some limitations. And you can't necessarily meet tree standards in stormwater swales. So those are things to consider. So single family versus multifamily, they're both very different. Location, obviously, is really different. The site that I was talking about that's multifamily, R2, is right there on a main corridor on Coburg. Smaller lot within, the urban center, right? Within the city limits, that's close to downtown. The South Hills, very different location, different circumstances. So I'm wondering, and I talked to Janessa a little bit about this, is that we could actually have code, so moving this forward, have there be, within the code, differentiating between multifamily, single family, South Hills, so elevation. So look at, right now we're not code writing, but just wanting to identify there are clear differences with these sites. I also, since I'm talking, I like the way they've written this, trees preserved or planted. So it's not just a preservation standard, that really it's that, yeah. So there are my thoughts. Okay, open it up for discussion. Anybody else? Yeah, Commissioner Fragala.
Well, I was thinking about this a lot last night as well, and wondering how we could take a multifaceted approach to it, in terms of identifying the different types of variables. That we talked about something yesterday as well, where there were like 3 different stages or 3 different categories that people would fall into, and then making the code within those. And so I appreciate what you're offering, and it seems like that could be a way to get at the clear and objective. Great. And then, I also noticed that a lot of this is based on lot size, and so I'm wondering if, it would also be permissible to include that as part of it, But where would we go at this point? Do we just approve the recommendation, knowing then that we want to look at it more and how the code gets written?
Yeah, because right now we're not looking at the code, but the way the recommendation, so what I want you to do is look at the way the recommendation is written, see if you're okay with it, because it's specifically saying a rating scale that takes into account tree type, health, size, and location. So what we can do is staff was thinking in terms of location is where the tree went, not location within the city. So I think we can make some caveats that's, give direction to go back, that staff go back, relook at what would be involved in some kind of rating scale, and then bring us back to the code. So it's really look at how it's written and how we might want to modify how this particular recommendation is written. Yeah, Commissioner Randall.
And I guess the rating scale then could be something like this, based on number of trees per square feet or that sort of thing. And I know initially when on the committee we were talking about that, we were kind of talking about health of the tree and those sorts of things, but I know that even caused a little bit of concern, just, oh yeah, that tree's not healthy, we'll take it out. And I think having something, I really like the preserved or planted aspect of this particular one. And I think if we leave it as a rating scale that could be determined somehow, by staff and then reviewed by us, I think I like that direction.
Okay, great. Yes, Jen.
Can I respond a little? So I want to clarify a little bit. When we suggest a rating scale, in a sense, what we're suggesting there is not just a flat rating scale for preservation, but a rating scale in order to determine whether a tree should be one of the 2 trees to be preserved. So there's kind of the preservation issue as far as what's the preservation level that we want to require as a minimum, and then there's the how many trees are we considering they already have, because we may not want to consider hollies or, non-native species or different things that right now it's just 8 inches diameter breast height. So the rating scale was more to get at kind of refining how we look at what's a significant tree to be preserved. And then you get to the preservation.
Okay, yes.
Silly question, maybe. What if the piece of, what if a property, for example, doesn't have trees? I mean, my property didn't have trees because it was a farm, and so the whole development. So and I know that's not our code, but are there requirements that you would have to plant them? Okay, so if there were no trees
No.
to start with, you don't have to plant any trees, but if there were trees.
Right, we could
There's
build
no
in
way to
exemptions.
develop multifamily, like if it was a different zone, you
Right.
would be required to plant some trees.
That is actually, I kind of liked their exemption up there under number 1. If there's insufficient trees existing on the property, you're exempt. So that kind of, something like that would cover that.
Commissioner Raby?
Thank you. So I like this example, and I like your qualification about you wouldn't necessarily preserve every tree, that there'd be a double test. And if it could be binary, that'd be the best thing. If it's this species, you don't get to preserve it. So it's a simple yes or no kind of thing. And then lot size, I think what you're talking about is both lot size and location?
Yeah. It's location
not-
in the city.
Yeah.
Because I personally, like I said, if you're talking about, I want as much density, I mean, personally, this is my perspective, I really would love to maintain UGBs, have density. So if you get a lot, like my example, I'd rather have it develop to its full capacity and not be preserving trees because of its location to proximity to infrastructure, services, et
Okay.
cetera. And you're gonna have replacement trees, but it's just not, we're not gonna be prioritizing saving those giant trees with
Right.
critical root zones that could take up, a third of the property.
That almost sounds a little more like zoning than could be, rather than location. I'm just imagining trying to draw a map of the city that says within these locations, this is your standard, and within.
I think it would be located within the R2 zone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
Or unless there's an R2 zone. and
Because there's
stuff,
also,
Right?
Yeah.
maybe not in R2 maybe, but there is a parallel between lot size and zoning. Okay.
So here's
Not
the difference.
necessarily, but sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, think about it, let's say you have a lot, I'm just gonna throw this out here, let's say you have a lot downtown area, like my example, right off Coburg.
R2, R3.
It's the same exact size
Yep.
as the hills,
Yep.
in the hills, both are R2. It actually is a location based on, it's flat, it's cheaper to develop, so it's gonna be more affordable. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that are related to location. I don't know how that would be determined, but that could be on a scale of rating. It's kind of like walkable neighborhoods. There's a whole, which we've used.
I think that could tie into, we're going to be covering some of the PUD-specific criteria and, our visual view, our view shed and preserving that and our, ridge line, those kind of factor into it. So I think that location could tie into that too, because a couple of, at least one of our recommendations involves maybe higher vegetation preservation requirements.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm envisioning too. Yes, Commissioner Borowski.
I like the points that you made, and I think it's definitely appropriate and clear and objective if we said it's multifamily against single-family housing. I worry about doing the location or elevations just because of the things that we've run into on other things. Grading on 20% slope, yes, you can say that slope's 20% and you cannot grade on it, but each piece of property has its own unique characteristics. And just to say that, okay, well, at 500 feet, this criteria kicks in. And at 1,000 feet, this criteria, it may be clear and objective, but it may not be the right criteria for that specific piece of property. So I'm a little bit leery about that aspect of it. I think you made some great points about multifamily and those types of projects because they do have significant different criteria that they have to go through that's different than single family. So I like that idea. The other one, I don't know if it could be written to, I mean, if it can be written correctly, I might be able to buy in on it, but I have hesitations about that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's reasonable, I mean, in terms of assumptions, so thank you. And I think getting at some of the other criteria, that actually might get to it itself. It's got other conflicting, view sheds, et cetera. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns the public bringing this up is that in the higher elevations, not above 500 feet, but would it be above 700 and higher, where you have a lot of trees, you'd like to see that some of those trees, if they were healthy and worth saving, preserved. So that's what this is a result of. And again, you would like to save those mature trees because they are much better for the climate than, a 2-year-old tree planted in the ground that won't reach that maturity level for 50 or 70 years. And that said, the whole point of this was that you could mitigate. So you could plant trees instead. You could, if you had a site that you absolutely couldn't plant trees, you could pay into a fund. So there were always going to be options. It's not like it would prohibit clear and objective. It just would mean that you would use one of those other approaches if you didn't save a few of the quality trees on the lot. And that's why the rating system was there. There's no advantage in saving invasive species or trees that we don't consider to be very good for the, they're not long-lived and they have other issues, holly and hawthorn and obviously even cottonwood in some places. So that was the reason the rating scale, where some other jurisdictions in Oregon have a sort of a rating scale and they rate the trees, the kind of trees and the size. And if it's not one that you would want to save, then it's, you don't even worry about it. And which you might have sites that have just a lot of scrub trees, so it wouldn't be an issue, even though there are a lot of trees there, but they wouldn't end up being counted by the rating system.
So are there any other commissioners? Yes, Commissioner.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. I think the way I see it is I think we can get where we want to be with option D, with the understanding that staff, incorporates some of the ideas and concerns in that we have here, so that it goes maybe a little beyond what that initial list was. But I don't think that was necessarily exclusive anyway. And so I think we can get there, and I think staff's probably heard what we are concerned about and what we'd like to see, and I think that would be enough to at least take it to that next step.
I agree. Okay, is anybody else? Yeah,
I
Commissioner.
guess the only question that I would have would be, as it moves to the next level, obviously, I have faith in our urban forester because I know who he is and I know the work that he does, but who's going to make that list and who's going to rate those trees? Because to myself, I may like a certain type of tree, but the code is going to say that type of tree isn't valuable. So that's a consideration too, because like I said, I trust our urban forester, and I think he would be a good resource for helping develop that. But if it is a rating scale, that is something that before it goes into code, it's objective. But once it makes code, it's clear. So that's just another point.
Okay,
To be clear,
Yes.
I'm not interested in a rating scale, but I didn't think that's what I heard.
Well, the last one that he said was,
Well, I know that's what's said here, but I think as we were talking about it, that to me, that's the slippery slope that I think we want to stay away from.
I think rating scale may be being interpreted really literally, and because the idea was to move away from where it is now, where it's any woody plant that's 8 inches or greater in diameter at breast height, basically is a significant tree, and we don't want to indiscriminately require preservation. And so it was an attempt to become more effective and efficient with how we do approach tree preservation. So the rating was kind of, as you're evaluating a site, looking at each tree, what's its species, what's its size, where is it located on the site, and trying to come up with some way to apply a value system to that as to whether it's even considered for whether it even triggers a preservation requirement. So like you were saying, like a holly doesn't trigger. So if you had a site that had 5 trees on it and 4 of them were hollies, and then you wouldn't consider those 4 hollies, you would consider that you have 1 tree, and if the requirement was 2 trees based on your lot size, you would be exempt. So it's getting around, and I realize that's complicated and getting in the weeds, and that's going to be some of what we're going to have to work through as we go through the draft code and see and have something a little bit more tangible to work with in front of you. Right now, I really just need kind of guidance on, is that a direction that sounds good, moving us away from having this very low bar of just consideration being the requirement now. And I would like clarification on Commissioner Taylor's recommendation to, do we want to focus on, say, subdivision and plan unit development preservation requirements when we're writing this and make that distinction, as opposed to site review or conditional use permit for multifamily or other higher density developments.
Does anybody?
Sorry, did I take you in the weeds?
The additional comments based on the response to Commissioner Ramey's comment. Sorry, I'm having a hard time breathing. Okay, so I'm going to start with, if nobody has any other comments, let's do a straw poll vote of this recommendation, and then Janessa did want feedback in terms of that finer distinction, just for if people were supportive of having that kind of second component to looking at code. So in reference, well, it's not up there, so on your sheet, right here, the one single sheet, there's the recommendation as is up on the screen. How many can support moving this forward to code? Okay, unanimous. Okay, so Janessa, do you want to explain, I mean, I can, but I think it's great if you do the distinction. I mean, they are different applications, so.
Right. So what I'm taking from, or what I feel like I'm hearing from you, is that something like this would be great as it would apply to single-family type, low-density residential developments, so subdivisions or planned unit developments that are effectively like South Hills subdivisions that require a planned unit development, but that we would have a different approach or a different requirement, or potentially not pursue it, a change under multifamily developments, things that would be higher density, and opportunities where you're really balancing the to go to the pillars of Envision Eugene, the supporting compact urban development versus protection of natural resources. And so I'm feeling like there's kind of a distinction there between those two types of developments and their requirements.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, my only caveat would be that you might have a requirement for, say, over 700 feet in the South Hill study area.
Elevation, right.
In other words, it's not solely based on multifamily, because R2, you might have some R2 property that's going to be developed at a relatively low density for R2, given the site constraints.
Yeah,
I couldn't hear.
Commissioner Baker, speak a little louder. Commissioner Randall couldn't hear you. So if you could repeat what you said.
I have the fan from this.
Yeah, so just.
Oh, the only caveat I added was that there might be, you might want to have a difference, say, above 700 feet in the South Hills study area, because the properties there would be developed at a lower density. And even if it happened to be R2, it's given the other site constraints, you might develop it at a lower density, and that might be, again, that's from the public, that was the area that was of concern, was the view shed. And also, steep sites and all
So remember, this is just, Commissioner, yes, Commissioner Brazel.
I guess I just want to have a clarification. So I am in agreement about the replacement tree part of the code, or being written into the code. So did you get that direction from us, that if there's significant tree that's going away, that you could, it's eligible for replacement? Okay,
Yes.
good.
Either or.
Yeah, I did
Yeah.
want to make sure that that was,
Yeah.
was part.
Preservation or mitigation.
Yeah.
Preserved or planted.
Right.
That's really nice, yeah.
And
We're
I'm,
all shaking our head, by the way, Janessa,
Thank you.
watching.
and I would almost be inclined to do almost a ratio. If it's a significant tree and you're planting it, maybe it's 1.5, or something like that, trees to each significant tree that goes away. I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but,
Like requiring more trees to replant.
if you're going to be
versus-
putting them in different spots, you could, if you're taking away a 80-year-old tree, like Commissioner Baker says, maybe instead of putting one tree in, you put 2 trees in, or,
The only thing that makes me
it's gonna go
concerned
up to
as
80
some of those heavily forested sites, we had an issue, it was quite some time ago, but there was a PUD that was a pretty heavily treed site, and they were required to do replacement trees, and somebody had to put 30 trees
all right.
on their particular lot. I think they had to do, it was higher than 1 to 1.5, but that's just something to think about.
Yeah.
It's one thing if there's one big, giant, beautiful tree
right,
versus
yeah,
20. So,
okay.
something we'll have to kind
Yeah.
of work through.
Maybe up to, if you remove 3 trees, you got to put 5 and then cap it at 5 or something. I don't know. It just, to me, again, that gets to the pillars. Saying that we're respecting both pillars, that we do understand that compact urban development is one of the things that we want, but we also want a healthy city as well. So, but I'm not tied to any of that. It's just a thought I threw out.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, actually, in the past, at least, sometimes the urban forester, when a tree is taken out in the planting strip, they'll require a replacement tree, but they'll require a replacement tree that's like 3 years old rather than the year-old or 5 years old. So you get a bigger tree to start with.
Yeah.
So that's another way of potentially dealing with a very large, mature tree that's is healthy. Obviously, if it's near its end of its life, then there's, we're not doing a lot by, preserving it for 3 or 4 years, so.
So I want to be conscientious of time, even though right now, because we have 4 more. So really, it's just a question, do you want staff to consider looking at these various applications differently? Just as they're looking at code writing. We could determine that we don't like it. CUPs, site review, they tend to be one lot, where PUDs, subdivisions are multiple lots. They're a comprehensive, larger development. I'm generalizing. But, so they are different in nature to some degree with different criteria. So it's just, is that something interesting that we want them to look at? Yes,
So you're
Commissioner
saying
Randall.
between, like, single-family and multifamily,
No.
or just between,
Uh,
Oh, that's a good question. Janessa, what?
Well, the application types that this apply to, partitions, are not a factor because we already have the recommendation to remove the tree preservation standard from partitions and keep them a tool for infill development, not make it harder to use that. So then there's the other 4 remaining, which is subdivision, plan unit development, which I see predominantly being the focus of this requirement. As Commissioner Baker said, a lot of this did come out of concerns in the South Hills area where you're seeing plan unit developments and subdivisions. So to me, what I think may make sense is, treating it differently, how we apply it to plan unit development or subdivisions that are for low-density residential, with the caveat that you might have a plan unit development that has multifamily involved. So we would have to kind of figure out how to handle that. But then that the conditional use or site review may have different tree preservation standards or stay with the consideration language that's there now if we can't come up with a good option.
Yeah, maybe they can look more closely
Yeah.
at whether it's R2, R3, R4, and R1, and what's the differentiation, or what's the difference?
I think that's a good idea. I think
Although-
we're trying, well, I guess I'm wondering if we're trying to
Yeah, I
get
think
there
we're,
now
yeah, I
before
know,
we
that's why I'm
Right.
like,
get
let's,
started,
if we
so.
can just keep it at that high level, do we want them to evaluate and look at for code language? All those in favor, oh, Commissioner Borowski?
Well, I just wanted to, I kind of had a question about going back to our last meeting. I brought up that there were some standards in there, like if you're adjacent to parks and those types of things. Did you take those into consideration? I mean, I brought it up.
Yeah, we haven't written code, so
I
I
know,
think these are all.
but this is direction for them going forward with
Yeah.
writing code.
I would say, is that something that the commission wants wants us to consider as we write code? I do remember that
Yeah,
you were
I mean,
saying like maybe
You know,
prioritizing.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a significant tree within 10 foot of a lot line that abuts a park, maybe give that a higher rating scale. I don't know, but that was, there. Like I said, we had that list of things, and to me, some of those things on that list were clear and objective and made good sense. I don't know. I mean, maybe you could identify, what I thought was if you could identify those and say, would you want these to, ones that you thought were clear and objective and met, community standards and wouldn't be hard to implement, maybe bring those back at the code writing thing and say, would you like these to be included?
Yeah, and I think that kind of could come about in the location element as far as like the parks. So, because we were thinking kind of location as far as, we don't want to have a high priority preservation requirement for a tree that's in the middle of the lot where a house has to go.
Right.
But your point kind of could be the other side of that, which is, there could, looking for those areas where they could be a higher rating for.
If it's along the
location.
riverbank bike trail or something
Certainly.
like that, try and preserve those trees without jeopardizing the ability for development.
Yeah, do you feel, I feel like it's already
I
embedded.
think, I just wanted
Now-
to make sure that discussion made it into what they're going forward with.
Okay, great. So, can I get a show of hands for us encouraging staff, giving staff direction to look at code, kind of the differences between the different application types, as well as kind of zoning, single family and multifamily? Show of hands. Unanimous. Okay, great. That was a great discussion. I think you guys have a lot of information
That
from
was
this.
helpful. Yeah, very helpful.
Discussion, yeah. Okay, let's move to these commingled for plan unit developments. So I'm going to have staff describe them. Do you have any kind of wisdom? And you guys have all reviewed this, so do you want to go one by one, or do you want to hear all of them? So as you've had a chance to kind of sit with them, are you ready to go one by one? Okay? Okay, it sounds like that's good.
Okay. I do have a little bit, before we get started on the actual recommendations, I wanted to bring up the South Hill study. So Eugene's Ridgeline is one of the most visually significant assets in our community, and it signifies the boundary of the southern edge of our city and has a distinct wooded character and dominant landform. In the late 1960s, community leaders recognized this as an irreplaceable asset and that needed to be protected and preserved in order to preserve its natural character. And so in 1974, we adopted the South Hills Study, which I have a copy with me if anybody wants to see. This applies south of 18th Avenue above elevations of 500 feet in elevation. So it aimed to balance the goals of utilizing the hillside areas for development, but also because it recognized that future growth would occur there, but also with preserving the hillside in its natural character. So to achieve these goals, it laid out several recommendations that are now adopted policies that include development standards and reduced density limits. So areas were identified for parkland, and highly visible areas, which we'll go over in a little bit, were identified to be preserved from an intensive level of development. 3 of the issues that we're about to cover relate to criteria that were adopted as an attempt to implement South Hills study policies in a clear and objective manner. So it's also a good time to talk about this cumulative impact that we tried to address in the draft preferred concepts report. You may recognize this note that applied to 6 of the different issues. So basically, the 30-foot buffer requirement, the 20% slope grading prohibition, the 1 acre accessible open space requirement, the South Hills study limitation over 900-foot elevation, the 300-foot ridgeline setback, and the 40% common open space issues. All of these requirements are clear and objective, but taken together, they can significantly limit the development potential of many sites. And in fact, out of the 51 plan unit developments that we've seen since the clear and objective path was an option, only 5 or 10% of those chose the clear and objective path. So it's significantly underutilized. So our first item can be found on pages 120 and 121 in the packet from yesterday. And it's the 1 acre accessible open space issue. The purpose of this one is that residents of a development have access to convenient open space. Both review tracks do have an open space requirement for clear and objective. It's that all proposed dwellings within a plan unit development are within a quarter-mile radius from, and it tells how to measure it, of an accessible recreation area or open space that's at least 1 acre in size and available to residents. Whereas the discretionary just really says that residents of the PUD will have sufficient usable recreation area and open space that's convenient and safely accessible. So one thing to think about is that open space is not one size fits all. So you can have private open space on single-family lots in their front yards and backyards. You can have open space that's in adjacent park or natural areas, or you can have it in nearby schools or playgrounds, and you can have on-site common open space provided in larger developments. One of the maps that we gave you yesterday showed Eugene's buildable lands inventory overlaid with a quarter-mile radius from existing schools, parks, and open space. I do want to point out that technically we used a proxy on that because the way the criterion is written, you're supposed to measure from the development site out, but that's difficult to do, so we chose that other one as a good way to show it. That map revealed that several parts of Eugene already meet this requirement of being within a quarter mile. However, there are some areas where only smaller undeveloped or underdeveloped land remains. So for example, sites that are only a couple acres in size. And so for these smaller sites, providing 1 acre of on-site open space can be onerous. So stakeholders mostly supported 2 options. One was to revise the distance requirement and another to revise the on-site provision to be scalable, so smaller open space requirement for smaller development sites or lower density developments. While hybrid option wasn't discussed specifically at the working groups, we felt when we were looking through it that it would be more efficient and effective than implementing either one of the 2 kind of top ideas. I do want to point out that changing the requirement from a quarter mile to a half a mile distance is consistent with our parks and open space guidelines, which strive to provide a public park within a quarter to a half mile from all properties, so roughly a 5 to 10 minute walk. And also that for underserved areas, allowing a scalable on-site open space would address the need for residents to have convenient access to parks and open space, but also limit the chance that we're creating a barrier to development, especially for those smaller sites. And it would better promote compact urban development. So that's how we arrived at this recommendation. Ready for questions?
I'm going to ask one quick question, and then Commissioner Baker is, I noticed in the first, so one couple, in the original existing code language, it's
Mm-hmm.
1 acre in size. Can you please explain, so that's total size, so it's gonna be, you can add up the various open space to total 1 acre? Or is it 1 solid acre in 1 location?
Multiple.
Have we done that with residential lots?
So it's all right, I mean, we are, if we revise it, that is, I wanna avoid that. Like if.
Avoid having it be
if the-
one.
Yeah, if it's scalable, I mean, because that's, anyways, that's getting more into code language.
I would say
but
the
this
only two
isn't clear and
examples
objective.
that I looked at, it was one giant open space, and that might have been just because that's the way it
Yeah.
worked for their particular site, but.
Yeah, okay, Commissioner Baker.
I was going to say the recent PUD we looked at had 3 sites that added up to an acre, the one in the South Hills. So that obviously was allowable, the language. A couple things. One is, wanted to,
Could you speak into the microphone?
okay, I wanted to make the point that when you measure distance to a park, it shouldn't have to cross a freeway or a river, in other words, or a railroad track. In other words, there are some, in other words, in a path that a pedestrian could take. So to make sure that we don't end up with a park on the other side of a freeway that doesn't, is never going to serve that property. And the same thing if it's on the other side of a train track or the river or something like that. So that's one point. And the other point, I think it's important that you include schools in as well as parks. But the point I'd like to make is that parks recently decided on this quarter to a half-mile distance. Traditionally, it was a quarter mile. And they changed the rule because they aren't meeting the requirements of a quarter mile. Other communities are. I mean, Portland does. Portland has parks every 6 to 7 blocks. So does New York City. In other words, the standard generally in the parks communities, you try to have a neighborhood park, which doesn't necessarily have to be an acre either in size. That's another thing that I would change. A pocket park, like the West University Park, is like maybe half an acre, if that, within a short walking distance, because when you have young children, it's difficult to get them to go long distances. So there's a reason for that, and that's generally why that dimension was. So I'm a little reluctant on changing it because it's really, the goal would be to have it be a quarter mile, and maybe there's some way to have some adjustment or whatever when it's not a quarter mile, but.
I have Commissioner Fragola and then Commissioner Randall. And, yeah, third.
I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, you didn't, then Commissioner Randall.
Okay.
And then Commissioner Borowski.
Okay. Just one comment. I know in the session as we were going through this, I was concerned what a 1 acre park was and looked up Charnel Mulligan, which is closest one to my house, and it's exactly 1 acre. So if you're familiar with Charnel Mulligan Park, that is a 1 acre park. In fact, it was like 0.98 or something, I think we looked up, and so it was just exactly an acre. I don't have a problem with the half mile instead of the quarter mile, just for reference there. But then I like to walk a lot, and so that's not a problem for me. And then my question is on C, where you talk about the scaling requirements on average lot sizes and density. In the parentheses, you say require more open space for higher density projects. And that almost sounds like if we start achieving our higher density, that we're going to be having to provide even more park open space in related to that. And those seem at odds with each other. So could you maybe clarify that for us?
I think on that particular thing, there's kind of 2 arguments. You could say that lower density, you want, have the park and you're not, if it's a lower density development, then you're not losing development potential. But you could also say that the higher density development, you've got more people who need open space. And so the need for open space and recreation area is, is greater for higher density. So I've heard both sides of that kind of argument, if that helps.
And Commissioner, was that
good.
Commissioner Borowski?
So I've got first a question and then a comment. Actually, they're actually both questions. So the first question was, you referred to private open space, and you referenced that that could be larger front yards and backyards, but you couldn't count somebody else's backyard as open space for a PUD, could you? Because I can't go into my neighbor's backyard and use their open space without a nice neighbor. So, I mean,
Let me insert really quickly. So what he might be, that was kind of my question. Open space in the code, like if you look at parts of the code, open space has private and public. And I was curious if that was part of this discussion or if this is some other equivalent of open space that's accessible by all. Because then you look at the higher density housing, and really I'm hoping that's having to do with private and public. And it's a combo, like in the multifamily standards, because if you've got an acre, anyways, it's going more into code, but let's just answer that question. So to get clarity, when open space is talked about in this particular segment, is this just common? Or is this more along the lines of code, which is common, public and private? And here, it's not super clear to me. It seems 1 acre.
Accessible recreation.
Yeah,
It doesn't
so it's
say
more public.
common. And then if you're not within a public, within the quarter mile from a public open space area, then to provide it on site to the residents. You're right, it doesn't now specify whether that's 1 acre contiguous, common open space or whether that's cumulatively private open spaces. Multifamily standards address that a little bit better with making that distinction to the requirements, but yeah.
so that's something that I think would be needed to be cleared up, because it is PUDs that we're talking about here, and those are, a lot of times it's single family, so we're not talking about using the multifamily standards per se. Second question, when Parks did their change from a quarter mile to a half mile, how much coverage of the city was there? Did we do the circle maps at a half a mile? Because and what I'm getting at here is, if we saw that there was deficiencies in some neighborhoods at the quarter, if we went to the half mile, are there no deficiencies and then every lot meets the standard?
Well, even with the quarter mile distance, significant areas of the city would meet that.
Right.
So expanding that to half a mile is going to increase the amount and really significantly,
What I'm saying
reduce the
is
amount.
if we go to a half mile, does that cover the whole city? Does that get every part so that basically you would not have to put any on-site open space?
I don't think it would quite get there. I think it would be a very small amount that would still potentially trigger this requirement. But we didn't do a map. This was already a proxy at the quarter mile, and so.
But you did do a map at a quarter mile.
At a quarter mile, we did.
So you didn't just.
We didn't run the second map at a half a mile.
Well, and
but
so
you can kind of interpret.
that goes to something that I think is important for PUDs in the South Hills, and that is, if you're saying, okay, Hendricks Park's here and Ridgeline Trail's here, so every property in the South Hill study is within a half a mile, you're basically saying you don't have to put any open space on any PUD.
Under this criteria.
Under
Under
this
this
criteria.
new criteria, yeah, and so that's why I kind of need to know that, because I don't know if I'm comfortable with that.
If I could point out, though, this is one where, again, this is part of the complexity of this project overall because there's so many interrelationships between the different issues and recommendations. There's still the 40% open space requirement criterion that we're going to address in a minute. And there's that applies in the South Hills, and but I do want to say that there's a distinction though, because this one is tailored a little more for recreation, and the other one is more based on the South Hills study policy around clustering and prioritizing steep slopes, highly vegetated areas. So to say that somebody's going to recreate in a very steeply sloped poison oak covered area. There is overlap, but then there's kind of, also some disconnects, so.
Okay,
But there is still open space requirement coming too.
okay, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Ramey. Thought I saw your hand earlier.
Okay, so the quarter mile issue, it did, when I glanced at the map, I'm sorry I didn't bring it to look at it again, but it did appear to me that most of the properties were covered under that criteria. And so going away from that seems like maybe not a community goal, that if we could stay at quarter, that would be the best without undue hardship to development. So some test about that, I think, is good. This particular language here, there's an opportunity to insert it, to say available to all residents or something that makes it clear that it's publicly accessible. And I think that's an important distinction. Then finally, there probably also needs to be some language about how small each parcel can be. So if you're scaling them and having some idea of how big 1 acre is was helpful, but presumably if you had a larger development, you would scale it to a larger, be 2 acres maybe. Or if you had maybe you would never go below 1 acre, but all of this is a long way of getting at, you probably don't want to divide those into much closer than a quarter acre. I mean, there wants to be some smallest increment there, and I don't know what that, kind of the neighborhood park size, I think, is probably the smallest increment. And I don't know what that is offhand. That's quarter acre or half acre, I'm not sure. But that should be pretty simple. And I think that implies that there's some flexibility. It does not be one chunk, but each chunk has to be at least this big.
Well, and I think that's a good guidance clarification that I would request from you all is that, especially in the context of a South Hills subdivision or subdivision, or planned unit development anywhere in town that's more low density residential, large lots, single family. Do we want to add up front yards and have that meet the requirement, or is this in addition to front yards and that the intent is, that you want to stay with the goal of having a larger park or larger open space area?
Speaking for me, it's not necessarily larger, but it's publicly accessible, so that it's not someone's front yard, which theoretically could be fenced, so it became inaccessible. So that, to me, that's the distinction.
And publicly, I just want to clarify that would be people in the development, because
Yes.
public park
could-
would be different.
I suppose it could be limited to just, do we do gated communities? I mean, if it was just a community, then it was only to that community.
Okay.
Commissioner Edwards and then Commissioner Randall.
I was just thinking, the distinction as to what it's used for. I mean, access to recreation is different than open space and yards that kind of create buffers and, provide shade and trees and all that other stuff. And I think that they're very different purposes. And so, as far as recreational spaces, that is, to me, that's different than open space. If it's, because just because it's somebody's backyard or, a space that isn't really, like you were mentioning, poison ivy and, just this heavily wooded area, that doesn't serve the same purpose as far as recreation or open space. So.
Commissioner Randall.
Well, and I think I would agree. I think right now I'm thinking maybe we should have taken all 4 at once.
Yeah,
You know,
and actually, what we can do
because-
is we can remind ourselves,
Yeah.
and staff's been doing, I mean, Janessa's been doing that. Keep in mind that this isn't in isolation. There's this
Yeah.
40% open space
Exactly.
requirement, right? That is more about open space.
And to me, this particular one is accessible open space, so that's not somebody's front yard, backyard, or whatever, which then falls under some of the private open space or
Yeah.
the other open space criteria. So for me, you know, looking at it as accessible open space, I think is the key here. And I'm comfortable, again, I'll say again, I'm comfortable going up to the half mile on that, because then that's, you know, walking to a park or something like that. You know, having the open space just so that we're not just all, you know, concrete and steel. That's more the coming up later aspect.
Can I bring up, I moved back to the slide with that shows the two criteria again, and just to point out that the discretionary doesn't actually say that it needs to be public or, yeah, so that one, under the discretionary, I think you could argue that front yards are open space and available for recreation, so. Recreation, I'll also point out that this is a really difficult one with clear and objective because recreation itself is a very subjective.
That's what I was going to bring up, is that actually recreation in itself is
Yeah.
laden.
Barbecuing on your patio or, yeah.
I think
I had
accessible.
one more, I forgot one
Yes,
more
of
point,
course.
and I think it gets to what Commissioner Ramey was saying as far as if there isn't one parcel, you know, and it being able to have a minimum size that you can add up to get to that size, I think would be good. You know, for the 1 acre, if it was a minimum, you know, 2 parcels at a half acre or 3 at a third, or, you know, something like that. Obviously, I mean, we've got a little, literally pocket park, I think it's at 15th and Charlton. And it's right on that corner where the mill race comes in. It's a little triangular shaped piece. It can't be more than about 300 square feet. You know, I'm not sure that would really qualify because I think that's too small, but establishing a minimum size that you could then add up to get to that acre, I think would be good.
Let me ask a quick question to you, staff, just because I think this is a good thing for us to remember, is we also want a level of fairness, right? So what's the intent of our code? You've got a discretionary path that's allowing a lot of flexibility, and we don't want to get to a clear and objective that's actually not necessarily meeting a similar purpose or intent. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so just keep that in mind as we move through this. So looking at that code language is important. So thanks for bringing that back up. Okay, are we ready, Commissioner Baker?
I just wanted to suggest that when you're looking at the minimum size, maybe use the West University as the smallest city park, not like a park block, but the smallest city park in the city, and you could use that as a rough idea of what they wouldn't have developed it if it was smaller than that.
Do you happen to know how big that is?
No, but that, it would be easy for them.
Yeah.
If I wanted to go and,
What did you call it again?
West University Park.
It's
14.
Hilliard and 14th
Yeah,
or
14th
15th.
and Hilliard.
They just switched the,
Yeah,
Wait,
Commissioner
wait.
Ramey, it used to actually be a park. I can tell, remember it was a park and they swapped properties so that it was more an effective city park
Yeah.
by the
Right.
university.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know it.
developed
You
as a
know.
park.
Now, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Fairmount Park as being.
Yeah, no, other side, west.
Right.
University side.
Well, but in terms of size, small, effective, open space.
Right.
It's 0.3 acres.
0.3.
Yeah, and that's what I've had a feeling it was
third
about
of
a
an
third.
acre, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking, is the smallest.
Should remember that, but I don't either.
Yeah, that's right, you should.
And it used to be just skinny, and they had to close it because of safety reasons, kind of.
Well, yeah, people would go through both ends. And they wanted a park that was more visible, so now it's on the
Do you want to do it?
arterial.
Okay, sorry, you guys.
Okay.
I let it go rogue there for a minute. We're gonna rein it back in. We gotta finish.
And this-
Okay, it sounds like we're ready for a vote. Okay, first one, all those in favor of moving forward, obviously, there's lots of code language that needs to be worked out. Moving forward, the recommendation, all those in favor? Okay.
Well, what about the quarter and a half? Should we have another vote about that?
Well, that was, it's per the language right here. If you disagree with that, you can vote differently. Yes.
So the way I interpret that is, while we're giving you direction to go apparently with half, that's an easy switch. If I get to make another run at it when we get to code, I can make an argument again that I'm not wasting anybody's time, I don't think, right?
I think that's a really good point, especially because then some of the more detailed questions can be answered because they'll get into
Presumably,
that detail.
just by asking the question, you're already thinking about, okay, how are we going to?
And besides, it says quarter mile to half a mile.
Two.
And maybe you bring the map with the different circles.
Yes. Okay, do we need to revote? Does anybody need to adjust? Okay, we'll move on. Okay, I'm hearing, we'll move on to the next one.
Okay. So the next one, let me get back to, okay. So now we'll go on to the limitation over 900 feet, pages 122 to 124 of the agenda packet. This criterion applies to PUDs within the South Hills study area. The purpose is to preserve land at higher elevations from, and I'm air quoting, but intensive levels of development. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. It appears the intentions of the study recommendations, which are policy, were to ensure the city's ability to acquire parkland as the hills developed, to guide the selection of those parklands, and to require private areas proposed for preservation through the planned unit development process to serve similar purposes that are set out for the proposed parkland. So again, the operative term is intensive level of development. This is the clear and objective criterion. No development shall occur on land above an elevation of 900 feet, except that one dwelling may be built on any lot in existence as of August 1st, 2001. And then the discretionary criterion, basically it's the South Hills study policy directly, which says that all land vacant property above 901 feet be preserved from an intensive level of development, subject to the following exceptions. Exception number 1 is the development of individual residences on existing lots, and exception 2, which I'll point out the clear and objective track does not address this at all, is that development under planned unit development procedures when it can be demonstrated that a proposed development is consistent with the purposes of this section. This section is the Ridgeline Park section, where this comes from, just for additional information there. So the purposes that are in that Ridgeline Park section really have to do with looking at suitable park sites. And then they recommend areas for park preservation or other preservation based on a set of 7 different kind of characteristics. So to ensure preservation of areas that are most visible, have high biological value, are good suitable recreation areas, provide connective trails, connect passageways for wildlife, contribute to the evergreen forest forest edge, and then also open space area that's a buffer between the intensive urban development and the rural development on the other side of the urban growth boundary, or urban service area as it was then. We didn't have an urban growth boundary at the time. So this map, and Bill, you'd mentioned this was, or Commissioner Randall, this was a map that I was trying to get a little bit more at that visual impact. This is from the South Hills study, and it was a map that they had to show the different levels of view potential. So if you look at the blue shades closest to that urban service area boundary, the darker the shade of blue, the steeper the slope, but the blue shades in general are the higher visual impact areas. Then you go to the green shades, which are the intermediate visual impact, and then the yellow, orange, and red are the lower visual impact areas. So then I'm going to move on to this map, which this is an excerpt from one of the maps that we sent you home with yesterday. And this shows the area, also shows the area around Spencer's Butte. And if you want me to flip back and forth, just let me know. But the blue hash marks on this map are the areas over 900-foot elevation. The yellow land is from the buildable lands inventory. So those are the vacant, low-density residential lands. And then the yellow outlined properties are the underdeveloped or partially vacant lands. So as you can see, we've acquired and then the green properties are the parklands. So as you can see, we've acquired quite a bit of parkland in the 900 or above the 900-foot elevation and within those areas that were high view potential. So it's also worth noting that there's no remaining ridgeline sites identified for acquisition by Parks and Open Space within the urban growth boundary. So they've been acquiring sites that are actually outside of the urban growth boundary. However, that said, concerns about view potential, geological stability, and protecting biological value still remain. So we may still want to prevent an intensive level of development in these high elevation areas. So our recommendation, forgot to take that animation out. Our recommendation is to revise the criterion to allow less intensive development, which we're proposing that would be limiting density to 2.5 units per acre above 900 feet elevation and include additional tree and vegetation preservation requirements to more effectively address the relevant South Hills study policy language. So we have some precedent to go on in defining that intensity threshold. Development has been occurring in the South Hills under PUD review, more discretionary, and that typically does occur at around 2.5 units per acre. So that's where the 2.5 units per acre recommendation came from. To improve the criterion's effectiveness at addressing the South Hills study recommendation and the intentions behind them, we could also limit the allowable footprint, building height, and vegetation removal. So again, where we were kind of talking earlier about tree preservation, this would be areas that are in that really high view potential area above 900 feet, where it may make sense to have more stringent preservation requirements than what we go with under the other standard. So this is all to help ensure that, quote, maximum preservation of the natural character of the South Hills, end quote, and adequate review of public consequences of development in the South Hills are consistent with the intent of the study.
Commissioner Randall.
I guess my first question would be the 2.5 units per acre, is that the gross acreage of the PUD? The reason I say that is we've got the maximum lot size of 13.5, and at 2.5 units per acre, that's 17.4. And I didn't know if that would create a conflict there. But
You are allowed a greater than 13.5. I can't remember if it's net or gross either. You are allowed greater than 13.5 if you're preserving trees, and then also if we're talking about open
And are
space,
PUDs
then
exempt from that, the 13.5?
no,
No.
they're not exempt
But
from
if
that. But
you
there
have-
are exemptions
Okay.
that apply.
And so this would then specifically address that?
And then also think about if somebody's
have-
providing open space, a percentage of the
Got it.
site is open space, then maybe the lots aren't going to be that large
Got
as
it.
well.
Okay.
There's different ways
Just wanted to make sure we didn't
No,
create a
I'm
problem.
glad you brought both of those up.
Depends on how you calculate it.
And I do have copies of the map that you went home with last night, if anybody wants or needs to see that. We have 2 copies here at the table. So,
Commissioner Baker, and then Fragala.
Yeah, and actually, the map might be helpful. 2 issues. One is, obviously, the discretionary path gets more review than the clear and objective path, and that's sort of why this was in place for the higher elevation areas. My comment is if this is a relatively small area in terms of total acreage, then we might just want to leave it as discretionary. In other words, trying to generate this new complicated clear and objective path may not be that productive in terms of actual housing.
Commissioner Fragala, and then I have Commissioner Edwards.
So you mentioned that the 2.5 units was based on kind of what's been happening already, and I'm curious, like, what has been the impact of that development on the visual integrity of the South Hills? I mean, since you're using it as a baseline.
I mean,
So no impact? I mean,
it's not no impact.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think you can look and you can see some houses, but I think that there's not an intense level of houses that you're seeing when you, I mean, I'm not sure how to,
And so then I guess I
quantify
wonder,
that.
yeah, how do we quantify? I mean, how is that visual integrity quantified? Is that clear and objective?
Well, we're not going to ask them
No.
that question. We're trying to come up with what would do that, but I think you raise a fair point. When we did comb through here to make sure it didn't say, no, you couldn't see houses, period.
Right.
And I do think I've spent a lot of time looking out that way or in that area. I think given the densities, granted, there's still a number of properties that haven't been developed, but I think that those standards have worked. To continue, you see a lot of trees. You see some houses, absolutely, they see you, but it still has maintained that is kind of the crown jewel in Eugene is the ridgeline, and it still looks pretty good.
Yeah, I still think it looks pretty good. And then a lot of the homes that are up there are also building with the sensibility of being in the tree canopy. I mean, we don't have any bright pink houses up there, right? And there is one. You can't.
We don't
see
want
it.
to talk about it. We can't talk about it here.
I don't have design review.
I know you.
Can't
I know,
see it.
whatever
Can't see
color
it.
you
Can't
want.
see it.
well, and I would
Pink
also
for a long
say,
time.
That was like pink before.
I would also say that that's another reason why
the tree canopy.
we also put in the kind of little extra recommendation that we could look at, if we want to preserve the visual impact or the visual, the visual impact there, then you could not allow huge houses. You could control the footprint. You could, require more tree preservation so that they are masked and screened within, the natural existing vegetation. So there may be ways to get at some of those concerns without completely precluding development there.
Well, I appreciate the added vegetation requirements in combination with the limitation adjustment.
Commissioner Edwards and then Borowski. Oh, you don't, I'm like seeing things.
seeing
today.
hands.
Commissioner Borowski. It's all right, people are going to get a chance.
So, I don't have a problem with the 2.5 units per acre. I mean, that's historically what's been built, either with clear and objective or with discretionary. We've seen that, we saw that with the BLI, and it was one of the contention points that they said, yeah, they're actually building it that much. That's why we didn't need to expand, was because we found these higher densities up there. But I guess one of my questions is, getting back to clear and objective, where are you standing to take the view? In that study in the South Hill study, when they did those blue and dark blue and lighter blue, where were they standing? And because if you move a quarter mile another way, the view is different. The other thing that I think is going to be tough to do in clear and objective is to say you need to keep your vegetation so that you can't be seen from down below. Or, I mean.
We couldn't do that.
Right, I know. So, I mean, protecting the view, I don't know how you can write that into something that's clear and objective. And the other thing is that the houses that are being built up there, especially the ones that are facing west, they're looking for a view. A lot of those houses, the view is an amenity, and they're going to be looking for that. So I don't know. I mean, I've got a house that faces west. I'm not at 900 feet, but I've got a view of that is an amenity to that house. I'm just curious as to what you think, how you're going to get to those protections by using tree preservations and those things. So if it's on the eastern side, if it faces the city, you have higher tree protection.
Well, if I could take us back to the purpose, to the purpose of the study recommendation. Again, this was the Ridgeline Park section. It was largely meant to address our ability to acquire parks in that and acquire the Ridgeline Trail System, which we have done. And so the study is very old. I mean, it's almost as old as I am. And and so a lot of the original intent, you're right, I don't know where they were standing on visual impact and, and determining that. However, I do feel like it did a really good job of helping us acquire an amazing Ridgeline Park system, and a lot of the property that is above 900 feet is preserved successfully. So I feel like, we need to take the stance that we're at a time with our community where we're trying to balance these needs of not growing our urban growth boundary unnecessarily and accommodating growth. And if these lands are not targeted for parkland and becoming public land, then how do we help them develop in a way that still fits our, or how do we guide the development in a way that lines up with our community values and whatnot? So the study doesn't say don't be able to see houses on the hill. I just want to make sure that that's not that's not the bar we're aiming for necessarily. But I do think that there are ways that we could, as we draft code, come up with some ideas as proxies that would help get in a clear and objective way, ensuring that they're not just sticking out like a sore thumb on the hill. So.
Commissioner Baker, before Commissioner Baker, I want us all to keep in mind, just because we are going to get tight on time, honestly, we've been taking quite a bit. We have 2 more after this. So let's try to stay away from code and get to just when you're thinking about it, what you're considering to move forward for evaluation for that code. If there's certain questions you have around that, definitely ask it, but or concerns, but let's try to just be thoughtful because we don't have much time. Okay, Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I would suggest that you look at this map, okay, because if you look at there's not very much area above 900 feet that's diagonalized. In other words, that on yellow, that's not green or already developed. So from my point of view, it's just a matter of investment of time and difficulty of trying to get all these rules right for this one. It may just be fine just to leave it as discretionary. You're not really having much of an impact. They can still develop it with a discretionary tract and do whatever they want in that regard. But there's so few areas. A little area here, there's a little area here. There's not enough land to make that, try to make this investment, from my point of view.
So does anybody have any other additional questions before we move this one forward?
I just have one more question, because in the recommendation, it says, and include tree and vegetation preservation requirements to more effectively address relevant South Hill study policies. But then she just said that the policy that is referenced in the South Hill studies that has to deal with vegetation and those things is from the park section, which we've already acquired it. So what policy in the South Hill studies are you trying to address with that second sentence?
I'm still talking about the purpose section. So the purpose section of the Ridgeline Park section addresses...
Okay, so then that should say purpose section, not policy language.
It's the same thing, though. I mean, this is the policy language.
I always thought that purpose and policy were different when it comes to legal definitions.
Well, the policy takes you to the purpose. So the purpose is kind of incorporated.
This purpose section is incorporated into the policy, so. Yeah.
That's,
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, but typically you're going to observe policy and not a purpose. But the
Right.
policy
Yeah.
forces you to look at the.
Yes.
okay.
And Commissioner, I just want to say that the preservation of those areas most visibly is one of those
Okay,
purposes, and
I
that's why I was trying
because
to.
I have had ones where it's like, you can look at the policy, but you can't look at the purpose.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. That's a
So,
clarification.
And we looked a little deeper, honestly, to try to figure out. I mean, we scoured through the South Hill study to try to really get an understanding of what they were trying to get at. We were trying to.
and to getting to Commissioner Baker's thing, I'm not sure that hits the goal of that every property is entitled to clear and objective standards.
Correct. Commissioner Ramey and then Commissioner Edwards.
Yes, so I like what you've done here. I think you've got some work to do about the tree and vegetation piece of it, but maybe combined with what we spoke about earlier this evening, the fact that 2.5 is already what's happening there, I think in itself is demonstrating that when you look to the South Hills, you're not seeing John's pink house, so we're good to go there. As far as I
My
can
house
tell.
isn't pink.
Oh, it's not pink? Oh, I thought that was the pink house we were talking about. And then finally, I think the issue about whether we're in or not, I mean, I think it's in. We wouldn't even be talking about it if we hadn't already decided that this was something we should address. And so we should just proceed with that and address it.
Commissioner Edwards.
So my question is, as I'm looking at this, I'll apologize when I'm speaking to the microphone. I mean, a lot of it is kind of sprinkled throughout other areas that have already been developed, meaning that it almost looks like infill in a lot of places. There are 2 parcels of developed land, on both sides of it. So I'm wondering what else is going on with these pieces of property that they're kind of, I mean, everything around them. And so in contrast to what Commissioner Baker is saying, there are definitely some pieces that are large, but a lot of it is almost appears like infill on here if you kind of look at the map. There's houses all around it and developed land, and then you've got this piece and this piece. And so to me, I would think that, we'd want to be able to make it easier to develop. It's within the UGB, and I don't know.
Okay, are we ready for a vote on this one? Okay. All those in favor of supporting the recommendation as proposed up on the screen? Okay. All those neutral? Against? Okay. And let's go to the next one.
Okay.
And you got those numbers? Sorry.
Yes,
You
61.
won. Yep, 61. Great.
Okay, so the next one is the ridgeline, whoops, jumped ahead. The ridgeline setback. It appears that the 300-foot setback may have been an attempt to apply a clear and objective standard to address a stated expectation, not an actual recommendation in the study. As Alyssa mentioned, we really scoured the study to try to kind of find the DNA roots to some of these criteria. And this one, I want to read you a quote from a portion of the study that's not the actual policy, but it was to preservation of the area above 901 feet would provide a buffer averaging several hundred feet along significant portions of the urban service area. End quote. So in the context of of the study area that this was taken, it was kind of an expectation that as part of their recommendations to preserve areas above 901 feet, that this buffer would come out. Otherwise, the actual policy recommendation that this would appear to come from is under the Ridgeline Park section again, and it's the recommendation that states that all development shall be reviewed for potential linkages with or to the Ridgeline Park system. So it's kind of an arbitrary 300-foot setback, and trying to find its source, was interesting. So this is the difference between the two. So again, that's the discretionary criterion is that all proposed developments in the South Hills be reviewed to determine if connecting linkages are possible, particularly north of Skyline Park to Hendricks Park and between Blanton Heights and Hawkins Heights. So let's see. we've not had a clear and objective PUD within 300 feet of the ridgeline, so we don't have an example to show you of one that developed under this. But again, 5 of the 51 that came in have chosen the discretionary path. So this is likely one of the criterion that's kind of so onerous that it keeps people from using the clear and objective track. The Ridgeline Trail was a vision that could be, but now it exists, and the city doesn't have any remaining sites within the urban growth boundary, as I mentioned, that are identified for acquisition. Some other points that I want to make is that the urban growth boundary does not necessarily correlate with the ridgeline. It's not precisely aligned with the actual ridgeline. There are places the Ridgeline Trail is where the Ridgeline Trail is outside of the urban growth boundary. And while it's essential to build more robust connections between parks and across the park system, as the policy sounds, this criterion doesn't necessarily help us get there. So in consulting with parks and open space staff, it would be a more effective tool for our team to require pedestrian and bicycle access through all developments, all residential developments to adjacent parkland and trail systems, which is what we recommended under one of the maintenance issues, COM 18, which was related to parks, and it's an odd, does not hamper access to our parks and open space. But that was our recommendation for that one, and that's already been moved on to code writing. So this is just an excerpt of one of the maps that we have here that shows the 300-foot setback from the ridge line. You can see the dotted line there. That's the setback. The yellow lots, again, are vacant, and the green lots are existing parks and open space. And that map's in front of you both there.
I have an
Are
incredibly.
you done?
No, not quite.
Oh, sorry.
Almost. That's okay.
Not ready for
some
my dumb
breaths.
question yet? Okay.
Take some breaths sometimes.
I have to collect my thought real quick. I also provided you an 11 by 17 map in front of you, and this is an excerpt from that. And this one is a me map. It's not a ArcGIS specialist map, but I found this one helpful. The dark purple areas are over 900 feet in elevation, and you can see from this map that there are many areas that border the urban growth boundary that may not even be in the high or moderate view potential area from the map that we looked at previously. So again, it's just the UGB does not precisely follow the ridge line. So one of the big concerns with this criterion is how effective is it even at getting at what it's intended for. So taking all that into consideration, that's why we recommended revising it to make it applicable only to the areas above 900 feet in elevation. That way you're more likely to be actually catching things that are close to the ridge line. In addition to revising it that way, we also could consider making the setback scalable to mitigate impacts to smaller infill development sites. Also, just to clarify, the original criterion does allow the city manager to make a determination that the site's not needed for parks and open space, and so we would keep that as well.
Commissioner Ramey.
Oh, I think you might have answered my very uninformed question, but the UGB is not the ridge line.
Correct.
Those are two different things. So at a minimum, the standard has to be rewritten to refer to something that is measurable.
Well, it's actually written to say that the UGB is used for the setback.
There you go.
Yeah.
Got it.
Commissioner Randall.
I guess looking at the map with the 900 feet and the vacant lots, there are some vacant lots that are completely within that 900 or above the 900-foot elevation. So are you saying then that the 300, are they unbuildable then?
That, as it applies now, if the lot is only 300 feet in dimension,
yeah.
Then potentially yes, or it couldn't be developed under the clear and objective standards, unless it was one house on a lot that was in
The
existence.
one house,
You
one
know,
lot.
there's
And
still
if that
some
lot
other
existed
pieces.
before
Right.
2001?
Right, and so then they could, well, and actually, they could just come, I believe, they could come in just, if, some of these aren't gonna require a PUD, am I right? And I'm trying to remember how that works. It's complicated.
It's, yeah.
That's right, this is just.
There may be
PUDs.
This is
I
just
keep forgetting this is
PUDs that
just
we're looking
PUDs.
at,
Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, I keep forgetting that.
So,
My apologies.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I haven't got a problem with the suggestion to go to 900 feet. The one suggestion I have is maybe when you come back, bring us data on the PUDs that have been built in the South Hills that actually had areas that were above 900 feet. In other words, it doesn't really help to know that they didn't, didn't use a discretionary path because maybe they were below 900 feet anyways, and this wouldn't have affected them.
You mean they didn't use the clear and objective?
As it is now, it applies in the South Hill study area. So it's not just limited to 900 feet. That's one of the changes. If you look at the 11 by 17 map, you can kind of tell, I guess it's a little difficult, but there's sections where you can tell there's not an equivalent criterion under the discretionary track. And so there's no setback from the ridge line.
That's what I mean.
Or from the UGB.
Right, so that they may have used that in any case for some other reasons,
Did I see anybody else's hand? No? Okay. I think
I got it. So revise to make setbacks applicable to areas above 900 feet elevation. Do you have any, can you give me any inkling what you think the setbacks would be? I mean, because you're revising them, you're saying there are going to be setbacks.
I think to some extent that's another area where I would love some clarification or direction from you all, because we could either simply, tighten it up and only apply it over 900 feet in elevation, but keep it at 300 feet. We could revise and lessen that 300-foot setback either to another arbitrary smaller amount or to link it to the size of the development site. So we really have options in how we want to move forward with kind of freeing this up a bit, but still, if there's concern about keeping the requirement in some form.
And would you say, so it says ridgeline setback for PUDs, are we still thinking about using the UGB as that arbitrary line? Are we thinking of highest point on the ridge? I mean, these are this is what we get paid for, is to kind of give direction to staff so that they come back with something that we can say yes to in the code section and not have to spend 3 hours saying.
We don't have a mapped line that is the ridge line to go by. And that's why the UGB was used as a proxy to the ridge line. So I'm open to other suggestions that could be implemented in a clear and objective manner. But I'm not aware of a tool that would be clear and objective that wouldn't require some discretion in determining what where the ridge line is.
Yeah, so that's why I have paused to moving this language forward, because if we're saying it's to the UGB, we're still might be eliminating certain things and using a line that doesn't make sense to make these lands developable.
So can I make a recommendation since it's 5 after 6? I don't, yep, you're right, because that's, and we only have 25 minutes, but I just said it wrong. So, is that I don't like arbitrary decisions, so obviously I don't think it's wise for us to take 300 and start talking about what that setback would be, et cetera. We're starting to get into details of code and details that actually need more researched reasons, and it's complicated. So if I understand the recommendations, if we just looked at basically revising the setback, because the applicable area right now is not just for 900 feet and above. And that's what this is focused on. So I think the code, when it comes back to us, we can actually address those two questions. Does that make sense? Is that an okay way to proceed? Or do
The
you
second
need-
question being,
Well, you brought up two
The scalable?
questions. I mean, it sounds like, I mean, there is some ridgeline trail should be considered as line as being the urban growth boundary within South Hills plan area. Where's that line? What's the actual setback amount? I mean, those are kind of specific code language that you can come back with us when you've looked at the code, looked at the implications more specifically, and that's when we get into the actual writing of the code.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, one of, a thing that could maybe be useful is 300-foot or a specific thing from the actual park boundary, the Ridgeline Park. That might be
It's a real boundary line. Yeah.
So, and it doesn't have to be 300 feet, but that could be our line rather than the UGB, which doesn't make sense.
Yep. Commissioner Randall.
And I agree with Commissioner Borowski as far as the concerns about that being, the urban growth boundary being the ridgeline, because I'm going to come in and I'm going to develop this PUD, I'm going to have a 300-foot setback because I'm above 900 feet from the UGB, and then 20 years down the road or whenever, we expand the UGB, and now my setback goes away, and I've just lost all this property that I could have developed if I just waited. And so, I think having an arbitrary line like the UGB is not a good idea. I would love to see I'd love to see us actually define the ridgeline and say, these are the highest points and where they dip, between Spencer's Butte and different areas. We just draw that line and then establish whatever the setback is from that point. That would be my preference. I don't know if that can happen in this phase or not. And I understand this is just PUDs, and the idea is to take a lot of that out of just all of the South Hills study and limit it to just those properties above 900 feet. And so, I think I'm okay moving it forward, but those are some of my concerns as we move forward. I think we're going to still have some things to address.
Yeah, so as long as you can hear that for the purposes of tonight, I would also encourage, based on this conversation, encourage staff to go back to what the purpose of this is. So once again, having an arbitrary line doesn't make sense with the consistency of how this was established in the first place. And we do have a ridgeline park now. So just consider that intent when we look at that code section.
and again, the tricky thing there is that in my interpretation, when you go back to the what seems to be the policy that it comes from, it's really about potential linkages with or to the Ridgeline Park system. And so that's where it goes back more to that maintenance issue that we had already, and we're addressing kind of elsewhere as far as getting those connections from development. And so this may kind of be a defunct criterion, and I'm not sure how to go with that unless there's more discussion and guidance from you. So, I mean, I feel like I can take away from this, maybe even trying to consider whether there's other ways to get at the standard that moves away from the UGB as a guide. And so this one may need to change more significantly when we come back for draft code.
Yeah. Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, just a suggestion, when you come back, maybe your mapping people can connect with Dogami and get their LiDAR maps, which shows the elevations, and you could at least draw where the real ridge line is on these maps, so we would get an idea, how, where it is relative to the UGB.
I think we can, look into if there's a way to do something like that, to adopt it as part of this process, a line on a map.
So it sounds like you've heard a few things. You also heard in terms of the 300 feet, you brought up scalable. So those are all under consideration. It sounds like even this could be a defunct criterion. So if I want to just get a vote just in terms of this kind of revision, then obviously there's multiple layers and items that need to be focused on in code language for this
And I think that there's opportunities for you to come back to us before it's fully code written and say, these are 5 things that we're looking at for this specific criteria, and which ones of them would you like us to hone down into in code? You know, that might be the next, you know, instead of just going from this level to code, there may be an intermediate level where you've done some research and come back and said, okay, we've got quite a few questions, what direction?
Okay, I'm going to get a straw poll vote on the recommendation COS 06 that's up on the screen. All those in favor? Okay, unanimous. Okay, last one.
Okay. So this one is the 40% open space requirement. So again, similar but different from the 1 acre accessible open space requirement. This one appears to come from the development standards recommendations from the South Hills study. So it is a South Hills study implementation. The clear and objective criterion says that development shall cluster buildings in an arrangement that results in at least 40% of the development site being retained in 3 or fewer contiguous common open space areas. So, and then it gives a little bit of clarity around what contiguous open space means. The discretionary track has the actual policy language, and you may recall from some of the PUDs you've reviewed recently, this is the one where it talks about encouraging clustering of development in areas characterized by shallowest slope, lowest elevations, least amount of vegetation, least amount of visual impact, and then encouraging preservation of the inverse of those, the intermediate slopes to steep slopes, higher elevations, significant vegetation, and significant visual impact. So, so it's really intended, the policy direction is really to cluster developments and the development areas and cluster the open space areas. So I just brought a couple examples so you can see the impact of the 40% open space requirement. And it's worth mentioning that the 40% number does not come from the South Hills study. That is an arbitrary amount of preservation. So this one is a 10-lot planned unit development that had 4.45 acres of total space and did 2.14 acres in open space in that lot A down at the bottom. Then this is a development that was a 26-acre site with 75 lots and 12.51 acres of open space, so about 47% of the site was open space. And it's worth mentioning there were some compounding factors on this one. Some of them were open drainage ways and 30-foot buffer that took up some of the or also counted as part of that 40% open space requirement. So this one is one that didn't really have a clear winner from the stakeholders and the working groups. Some wanted to eliminate it altogether and rely on, the requirements for lots or for front yards and on single-family lots and multifamily open space requirements. Some wanted to make it scalable relative to the size of the lots or the slope of the development even. But our recommendation tried to get it reducing the requirement since the 40% figure is arbitrary, and realizing, of course, that any other number that we do lower than that is also arbitrary. But the 40% may inhibit efficient use of land by preserving large areas of buildable land, especially when applied to lower elevation areas and less visible sites, which it seems like the policy intent here was to preserve highly visible areas. And so it may not be effectively directing development in the appropriate areas. That's it.
Any comments or questions? So I have a question, just because I'm really unfamiliar with kind of the details of code in the South Hills in particular. How can you overlap these? So when you've got open common area, can you actually have are there exclusions? So in that common area, right now, this isn't recreation. I'm seeing that. So, right, but it's not specifically exclude, right, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. So where I'm getting at is you can double layer, you can double dip, meaning you can have you can have slopes that are extreme. The common open space can be areas that you're using for stormwater, can common open space. So what is common open space?
Yeah, I don't
You have, we don't have that at the.
We do have a definition of open space in the code.
Great.
Under open or common?
It says common.
I think it's under open, common.
I'm gonna look under both.
I think they grouped it open space, common, open space, private.
No, actually, common open space comes in the Cs.
In the Cs.
Crazy.
Okay.
So common open space is an area for the use or enjoyment of all residents of a development site, excluding parking areas, streets, or other areas designed for motor vehicle circulation or storage. Common open space may include areas that provide for the preservation or enhancement of natural resource habitats.
Okay, great. So that's the same common open space that's used in multifamily and
Same
so
de-
same definition. Okay, great, thank you. That was my only question. Commissioner Baker?
Just to clarify, so that it includes parking areas,
Does not
does
include,
not.
excludes.
excludes, okay.
Commissioner Borowski?
So then front yards and backyards would be considered open space?
It's the common.
Common.
Yeah.
But read the definition.
Well, it has to be for use of or enjoyment of all residents.
Oh,
Typically, if they do that, then there's an easement provided so that people have access and.
I mean, the two examples she provided you, it was
yeah.
absolutely in common ownership. I mean, it was a separate lot from all of the rest of the lots.
Commissioner Edwards?
So is it have to be accessible as in, it says open space have to be accessible for all residents. Does it have to be physically accessible, or can it just be this nice view that we can all enjoy? And I don't know. I'm confused about what accessible means.
I think that's,
Let's actually be careful with that language.
yeah. I think we've interpreted it as you need to have access to it. And so that's why again, we have a whole 5 previous applications that have used this track and actually addressed this criterion. So I think some of what you guys are struggling with is exactly what, why we don't see a lot of applications going through this, and because, and why we don't have a lot of history to explain how it's been used.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Where did the 40% come from? You said you didn't know, or that it was arbitrary, so, okay.
It's
And the
Nobody knows?
30% is arbitrary.
And so if we don't know where the 40% came from, changing it to 30% is maybe equally arbitrary, so.
yeah.
But does at least provide an additional 10% that,
I think because the policy says that the development shall be reviewed to encourage clustering of open space elements of different developments, and there's this maximum amount of continuous open. So I think it was an attempt to try to quantify in a clear and objective way very vague terms.
Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Borowski.
No, I was just going to add, it's focused on clustering and trying to get the buildings together and creates, try to keep those buildings down low on the site if possible, and leave the vegetation and trees in open space in the higher elevation areas. That was the goal.
Commissioner Borowski?
I think that, that was the goal. But I don't see in this recommendation how it would lead to clustering and how it would lead to anything except for saying you can't use 30% of your land. That's all that I read in this. I don't read that this is going to make them cluster. I don't read in this that it's going to make them develop at the lower elevations or the lesser slopes. All I see here is you're locking 30% of my land up because the Eugene Planning Commission decided that that was the arbitrary number that they wanted to go with.
So let me just, let's ask staff
Yeah,
that question,
yeah.
because the way I
That's
read
what I
this
was
was
asking.
totally different. I was reading it as, we're keeping this, we're just reducing the percentage, and you're addressing to more accurately implement. So if you can explain, that's a very
Yeah.
good question.
Right.
Let's make sure there aren't.
I mean, I agree. I think that as you see it implemented under the discretionary track, you're able to get it more of the intent. I mean, it's a very discretionary thing to say the shallowest slopes, the most vegetated. So it's a really highly discretionary policy that I think that's why we ended up with this just kind of flat 40%. And I agree with Commissioner Baker that it probably, by requiring such an onerous percentage, then it kind of forces the squeezing of development into other areas if you want big open spaces. I don't know that, well, if you read the recommendation, I don't know that it really effectively implements this policy. It doesn't, as written now, it doesn't really address the clustering based on those aspects that we want to try to encourage. But I'm not quite sure how we get there in a clear and objective way. And so that was part of the reason this one was a squishy one, because there weren't really clear alternatives that came out in when we were trying to generate concepts. We didn't get a lot of new ideas too that could get at it better, and so at least dropping the requirement tries to make it a little less onerous.
And I think that that's probably where the people who said do away with it altogether felt that single-family lot, single-family setbacks and those types of things address those needs without having to lock up 30% of buildable land.
So let me make sure I'm understanding, because actually now, if you read, here's the code language. You've got the existing code language, which is development shall cluster buildings, blah, 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 blah. And this recommendation only says revise to reduce common open space requirement to 30% and more accurately implement the intended and relevant South Hills study language. So I actually am assuming you're taking that 40%, you're turning it to 30%, and then you're using this language, and you might slightly modify it to address the intent. So there's, to me, lots of broad area for additional, I'm not reading it literally like Commissioner Borowski. Okay, great.
But that's how I interpret it
Me too.
also. It still includes the clustering
Yeah,
language.
still includes that, it's still, yeah. Did I have Commissioner Edwards and then Commissioner Ramey, and then Commissioner Rand?
This is,
So my question was about the clustering. I'm just curious what makes that desirable? I mean, maybe that's a silly question, but if I'm thinking about looking at, the ridgeline, and I'm, kind of wanting to space out, I mean, I don't know that I'd want to have everything all clustered, but maybe there's a efficiency reason or something else that would make sense to cluster. So I don't know. That was just.
Well, again, the way that it lays out the clustering, it really was to help preserve steep slopes, really vegetate, like existing conditions that to preserve those areas. So I think that's what the intent was to get at. But while in the clear and objective track, it has the clustering language, it doesn't have the hierarchy of, steep slopes and,
okay.
yeah.
Commissioner Ramey and then Randall.
So if the intent is to cluster the structures so that they avoid the parts of the property that are either more desirable for preservation or maybe buildable or higher elevations, this doesn't do that precisely. And I think it's not clear what cluster buildings means. So I think there could be a lot of challenges about trying to interpret whether that's clear and objective. What is that? 3 out of 5 are clustered, and the other 2 are clustered by themselves, or they're in a circle, they're all around. I mean.
Yeah, I think the clear and objective part is that you have 40% of your development site that's
Right.
preserved.
And then we're back
So.
to
And then
Commissioner
we're
Borowski's
back there.
point, which is, well, it's just this ribbon that runs all the way around the property, and that's my 30%. Thank you very much. which might be a good thing, I don't know. So I don't know how, it's hard for you guys, I don't know how to get back to what the intent was, that long list of very unclear and objective things, which all seem good, but they're hard to make clear and objective. And all it seems to do is take 40% out of buildable land at this point. And so whether there's some way to
Get a definition.
make it less than that, but it just, there's no logic to that.
Get at the objective.
Commissioner Randall.
And I think what Commissioner Borowski was getting at is what came up in the groups from those that felt this was redundant and we should just take it away, is with, I think, low-density residential, we've got a 50% lot coverage maximum anyway.
Yep.
And so you've already got 50% of each lot that is open. And so, you know, why impose this additional requirement when you've already got half of the space open? So you've got half the space now of those lots that has to be open, plus this additional open space that's adjacent to, accessible to, maybe used, maybe not, maybe just visually enjoyed, maybe not. But to me, it seemed redundant as well. I will support the 30% because I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think I would prefer the whole thing just go away and we rely on the other.
Yep.
Can I just chime in? It seems to me, so a PUD, essentially, one of the purposes is to enable different housing types than are typically allowed in R1, correct? Okay. And so you might have attached housing types, right? You might have more apartments in addition to single-family homes. If you don't do a PUD, you're just going to do a single-family detached type of home, except under certain circumstances.
In the South Hills, you generally have to do a PUD, even if you just want to do a standard residential, single-family subdivision. And so, I mean, that's a lot of what we see.
Okay. I was just thinking that overall, the intent and the trade-off with doing a PUD versus a standard subdivision of some kind is so that, you know, with the attached housing types, these other different kinds of housing types, that you have some give and take for that you don't cover the site with a more intense housing type. But there's more clusters of development mixed with open spaces that provides, it's a different impact, it's a different feel.
Commissioner Borowski and then, no, okay, Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, again, I want to say that from a clear and objective, the requirement of the big chunk of open space does force the developer to cluster it, and that's visible from, because these are up high on the, you know, in the South Hills area, that development pattern is visible. You have areas that are essentially left undeveloped, that have trees and also provide, in this case, they provide habitat and habitat connections to other areas. So there is a purpose to it. It's not like just we've taken area out of the backyard. We've allowed for visual impact from this, even though this doesn't meet completely the criteria in the South Hill study. It does partially meet that.
Just to clarify too, though, this does apply even in 500 foot. So it's not just the high visual areas. It does apply indiscriminately in the South Hills area.
That's not the intent. Commissioner Randall, did you have something? Yeah. Okay, are we ready for a vote on this one? Okay, all those in favor of making a recommendation for this one? Or supporting the recommendation? I'm really dying here with my cold. I'm like almost ready to go to bed. So
More for Metro.
all those in favor of moving forward the recommendation up on the screen? All those in favor? Yeah. All those opposed? And all those that need more additional information?
Can I
Neutral.
clarify before I possibly change my vote?
Yes.
You know, I said that I would support the 30% because I think it's a step in the right direction, but that I'd like to see it go away. Is the next option perhaps, if we don't send it forward, that it goes away?
Yeah.
That way people voted against that, then I would like to change my vote to against.
Okay, so let's go again to yes. Who are the yeses that support exactly this? Because yours just changed and I don't know what the numbers are. Okay, we got one. How many of those opposed? Okay. So now we're going to go to the next option, which I'm going to go with, Commissioner Randall said it. So let's say that we're going to just eliminate and rely on COS 04, so it's letter D. All those in favor of the recommendation in letter D?
Can I clarify real
Yes.
quick before you straw poll that one?
course.
Because I think it's important to point out that D and E kind of go together because they address low,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep, that makes sense. Yep, that's what I actually was going to.
D&E.
Yeah.
Okay, are people clear
Hybrid-
about that?
Hybrid
before
of
we-
DE. Is
Okay.
that what we're voting for?
Yeah, hybrid
Okay.
DE. Okay, I'm getting waves. Okay, how many support a hybrid of D and E? Okay,
Well,
if you want to ask a question, it's fine.
I mean,
We're 1
that's the
minute.
thing. I mean, we came to the table with an expectation of discussing the recommendation. And I didn't, I looked at those, but I didn't look at them in depth because I was looking at the recommendation. So at this point, I would feel uncomfortable voting for it
Yeah.
without looking deep, moving it forward, without having to look at the implications of what DE hybrid actually would do. Because I didn't look at that, and I didn't think about that, because I was looking at the recommendation.
And I have the same problem because I would have some concerns because this would be applicable even above 900 square feet, 900 feet elevation. So I would be concerned about that because this is this is where it was supposed to be used in the higher elevation. So to eliminate the requirement for clustering in the clear and objective path seems to be counter to the South Hills study policies.
So we're already 2 minutes over. Can you kind of discuss what our options are? I mean, if you brilliantly can come up with a 30-second elevator speech to explain this, then that is brilliant, and then we can revote. But if you don't feel like that's possible, what are your suggestions?
I mean, you can take the vote, and I can just be a sideways thumb.
Are we willing to take an additional 5 minutes? If that's, I don't think, it's not necessarily going to, at least for you. What are your thoughts?
Well, to respond to Commissioner Baker's concern, over 900 feet, we still have the other criterion that limits density to the 2.5, units per acre, as well as, thank you, and as well as that we're gonna work on other things that would help address the concerns in that highly visible area. We also have the open space requirement that's still in place and that would address recreational. And so I think what you've discussed is definitely an option, that letting go is definitely a viable option. I'm not, and we could discuss it more when we come back with draft code on that.
Commissioner, I think, like I said, I can just, if the vote is 4-2 or 5-2, they can move it forward, and I might be able to get my answers at the
try
next
next
level.
one.
I
Okay.
was just saying, I
Let's try
couldn't,
that.
I couldn't vote for it without carefully looking at it. And
Okay, so you had a vote that there were 5, and 1, more information, 1 was a no.
So, yeah, so it's moved forward.
Because he supported actually the recommendation.
Okay,
So that's fine.
okay.
I don't want to stop the process,
Yeah,
just
okay.
because, but I don't also.
Well, I had heard Commissioner Edwards say something too, so I was
Yeah.
wondering. Yeah. Okay, does everybody feel good about that? Okay. Thanks for staying an additional 4 minutes, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Sorry for my, evening when I'm sick. It's gonna be rough. Okay, good night, everyone.
Thank you.